the AI Kubernetes Show.
Hello and welcome to the AI Kubernetes Show, coming to you live from KubeCon in Atlanta. I'm your host, William Chia, and we have been uncovering all of the ways that the latest generation of generative AI, LLMs, agents are changing software development in general, platform engineering in particular. And I am very excited to have with us as a guest on the show today, Alexa Griffith, who is a senior software engineer of AI and infrastructure at Bloomberg. She is also a podcast host at Alexa's Input, and she's involved in many elements of the CNCF, in particular, tag leadership for infrastructure. Alexa, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, one thing is we've heard from folks at startups, folks in large enterprises, some of the similarities in those stories and some of the differences. One thing I would love to hear from you is, what's the story at Bloomberg? How did they become a cloud native, AI native organization? Where did that come from at Bloomberg?
Yeah, sure. So actually today, Stephen Bauer told this story very well in a keynote. So I'll kind of just reiterate what he told because he's the head of our org and he has been there since the beginning. And I think it's a wonderful story. So back in 2016, they started looking for ways to build a platform, and they were looking into Kubernetes, and they thought that the AI use case and workloads would be a good place to start because at the time they had a not as tight SLA as the other products. And so they decided it would be like something low risk to try. So we actually started with AI. That's where it began, which is probably unusual for most other organizations with Kubernetes. And so they attended KubeCon, and there they met some Kubeflow people. And this is how the whole open source forward idea came along. And this is when we started really investing heavily in open source. And because we saw how useful it would be to build with people rather than beside them. You know what I mean? So they got into the Kubeflow community, and my manager, Dan Sun, helped to found what was known then as KServing and is now known as KServe. And actually, it's just became a CNCF incubated project, which was a lot of hard work from a lot of people. And yeah, it's really grown. It's for self-hosting models on-prem. They found that that was a big thing that people were struggling with, how to do it scalable, how to be reliable. And so it's an abstraction that was built on top of Kubernetes to help people with that. And from there it grew. I mean, now the whole platform is running on Kubernetes. All of our different data analytic products, streaming, everything really. And now with the new era of Gen AI, we're starting to, rethink the things that we need and how our platform has evolved. And a new open source project, the Envoy AI Gateway, which is built on top of Envoy, is something that my manager, also Dan Sun, and Bloomberg engineers collaborated with Tetrate engineers as well to produce. So that's something new that's come from Gen AI. And I think that it's just really a great organization to be a part of and to witness how they're focused on building solutions in the open with the community. So that's kind of how Bloomberg got into it. And now they're a big part of the open source and CNCF community. So
This is such a wonderful story for many of the open source projects within CNCF, with many of the companies here. They were open source companies, they were software companies, and they've recently become AI companies. At Bloomberg, they were an AI company doing AI and said, oh, maybe this cloud native stuff could help us out. That is a really fun story. So in your organization and the team that you work with has been doing AI well before the current generation of LLMs, Gen AI, agents, these kinds of things. I'm curious, what's the cultural shift been like for the AI team at Bloomberg? In the old days of AI, in those ancient times, and now in the modern era of Gen AI, what's the shift been like in the way the team operates?
Well, within the team, the platform itself, I would say that, we definitely have a strong foundation of our predictive AI platform. And for us, we've really focused on composability and interoperability. So being able to manage these different parts with the CNCF tools, for example, being able to switch them out and use them and being able to build on top of them is really important for us. So we built a strong foundational platform with our predictive AI, and we definitely didn't want to throw that out. I think that we think of it as an evolution, not a revolution, for sure. It's something that we're building on top of. So we still fully support predictive, and there are a lot of great use cases for that. but also now we needed new tools and new features to also support the generative AI, for example. So they have different load patterns like token streaming and more GPU utilization. So all of these open source projects that I just mentioned, like the OpenAI Gateway, need to manage the traffic because now we need to have a more hybrid cloud environment. All of those things helped us to build on the platform that we had to offer these new capabilities.
This is really interesting. As you say, the load patterns have changed. Token streaming, GPU usage are different use cases, but in some cases you're applying the same patterns, but just to the new technology.
Yeah.
Is it, aside from say like, hey, we are leveraging open source projects to help us out with this. Are there ways that your workflow has changed or any specifics on, for example, tackling a challenge like token streaming in the realm of Kubernetes? That's seems like a pretty big challenge.
Oh yeah, I think there's like quite a bit to unpack there for sure. I will say first is there are different protocols, so different ways to communicate with different models and different providers, and understanding all of those. And as a platform team, trying to make it easier for people to use it and like lowering that barrier, especially in the face of this constant change that we're seeing, is definitely something that we struggle with as a platform team. And then additionally, I would say with agentic systems, it gets a little bit harder. So like, for example, the protocol with agentic is MCP, and our CTO, he refers to MCP as the API of the agentic AI era, which is true, and it's great because it gives us just a unified way for agents to talk to different tools and different agents. And all this is great. We still have protocols, just like in REST APIs, we have a protocol for them. And now we just have a different one. So it's still a protocol, it's still a way to communicate, but now we just need to add more support around it and make sure that everyone gets on board and uses the same thing. So I think that's one thing that's been a struggle. Also with agentic AI, observability. So you definitely need distributed chasing and being able to monitor things, because when you think about, if we take it back to non-determinism, if you think about an LLM, what's hard about it is that for a given prompt, you can get different outputs. And the tokens is what we need to measure for cost, because that's what determines how much work we do. And because we're not able to predict based on the input what will be the output, then that causes the variability that we're trying to understand, right? And again, with agentic systems, it's even more, because now we have the cost of a token output that's still not deterministic, but the LLM is also deciding they're telling the agent how many queries to make, which for a given prompt is also not deterministic. And what do queries do? Getting data from a database, making calls, that's also a cost. So I think that this is a really big challenge, because per request or per input, it's hard to determine the cost. And then maybe you want to optimize that to control it. And you set some controls. So maybe you say you can only query 3 times, but then you might be sacrificing the validity or the quality of your output. So I think there are just a lot of new ways to consider things. For example, distributed systems have always been something that we've dealt with, connecting to a lot of different microservices. And you could say that architecture, you can think about that in that same way here. But what's different here is that, you're not really sure for a given point or a given input how many queries it will make. So all of these things are definitely challenges around agentic and understanding it. So that's just one piece of challenges that we did deal with.
This definitely resonates with me in my own personal prompt engineering. I add very often, respond with as few tokens as possible to many of my queries. I heard one of the controls that you implement might be something like limiting the request load, and again, there's trade-offs there. I'm curious, is there other examples of guardrails you've found or that you're trying out in order to wrangle this non-deterministic nature?
Yeah, so I think basically what you're trying to do is put a deterministic cage and a non-deterministic core. So how can you do that? And I think there's certain measures, and there's certain, especially with security, this ties in, for example, how can you make sure that you're giving a good output, whether it's with ratings or a safe and secure output. So I think that Bloomberg has also done quite a bit of research, and I'll share the links as well, around these different guardrails that you should have around LLMs and your agentic systems. For example, they found that it's very domain specific. So financial services may need a certain type of guardrails compared to others. And also, there's this assumption that RAG systems are a bit safer to use because they're pulling from the document directly. But Bloomberg actually did a research study that found out that that's not true, that you shouldn't rely on that. So I think about like the conceptions people have and the work they put into understanding their system and the things we take for granted in general about that. Just understanding that maybe those assumptions aren't always true.
This is unsurprising to me that RAG is not just like a panacea, and now I have the Bloomberg research to prove it.
Yeah.
We will put into the show notes all of the links that you're mentioning. And this is very interesting. You talked about, Alexa, the security implications, but definitely in terms of new threat surface area, new security concerns that can be introduced, you have talked a lot about how there's cost implications, which we heard a little bit about, but I don't think is talked about enough, the cost implications of how many agents you're spinning up or how many tokens you're consuming. Whereas in addition to that cost, there is also security concerns. And just tell us a little bit about, the threat surface area here.
Yeah, like you said, because it's non-deterministic and we have these certain patterns, there are a few different security concerns that have arisen. Starting with the LLM itself, putting those guardrails, understanding them. Also, as far as security goes, LLMs can also be used for red teaming, better red teaming practice, like more intelligent hacking. So in a way, I like to look at it from a few different ways. Like there's always a perspective where LLMs help you become the opposite thing as well, like more secure. For example, if you have a bunch of code reviews and you're writing a bunch of code with Gen AI, another perspective of it is, well, also LLMs can help you review the code. So in that same way, LLMs can also help you to become more secure. I also think that with evaluations, like using LLMs as a judge, that helps with understanding the accuracy of your model, the hallucinations, like if it's leaking any personal data. Those type of scores can help you. What's interesting there, though, is a lot of times you're using the LLMs as a judge of another LLM because it's a text output, right? So how do you analyze and understand text from another language model? So in that way, you also need different methods to create a deterministic cage around a non-deterministic core. And how do they do that? They have different methods, like running them multiple times or different configurations on them. And I think that, that's like, they definitely help you, even though they have a little bit of non-determinism in there. But it's just another pattern to keep in mind that you need to create around an LLM in order to ensure security. And also, I think it's also a bit of a people problem too. Or a cultural initiative to take on, because there's also a lot of tools and businesses around all of these things, but around making sure people themselves understand how to use AI and use it better, especially within the company. So I think it's a cultural shift, and it's definitely a technological evolution too. Yeah.
The temptation may be to have LLMs all the way down, but you really can't go there. It's somewhere you got to break the recursion loop and have some kind of null case. Maybe I'm going too deep in the analogy, but the human in the loop at some point to evaluate the LLM, evaluating the LLM, evaluating the LLM. But also some of the guardrails you've talked about, like repeat runnings, these kinds of things. I really like your verbiage, and I want to capture it. You're saying putting a deterministic cage around a non-deterministic output.
Yeah, around a non-deterministic core. Yeah.
Around a non-deterministic core. Yeah. This is it's got the cage. You have a non-deterministic core. This is a key analogy that I think has been interesting. You also touched on the topic of the human component. We've talked all about this artificial intelligence, but human interactions, cultural changes that need to happen in the way we interact with each other. You also talked about empowering and enabling people. I'm curious if you can tell us just a little bit about this cultural shift and maybe some tactics that you leverage in order to educate or bring others along on the journey with you.
Yeah, I think the topic of how Gen AI has changed organizations is an interesting one. I think that, again, we were always serving predictive inference, and going from that, shifting to generative AI, the culture around generative AI outside of a company just generally is very fast-paced. It's very quick. You can see it. OpenAI comes out with something, then another company comes out with something. Everyone's racing. And I feel like that cultural shift bleeds down also into companies and how people produce. People can produce faster as well. If you think about the model development pipeline, in predictive AI, there's a big training component there. You need to train the model, you validate it, deploy it. Now, you just can download a model, an open source model that does pretty well, and you're straight to deploying. So that makes it a lot more fast paced. And being on the inference team, that means that this part of it has grown a lot. And there's a faster pace to getting a product out and being able to deploy it. I mean, it's interesting also how the work that itself has shifted and it's a bit dynamic. So now the AI engineers will focus more on using the model, validating it, understanding it. So that shift is really interesting to me. And it's caused us to need to be a lot more flexible and dynamic in our ability to plan and change priorities. But also at the same time, it means in some ways, especially when it comes to hardware needs, that you need to be more strategic and plan forward. So you kind of have both components there, I think.
This is really fascinating. A need to both be more long-term thinking because GPUs are so expensive and so fragile. You need to plan for that capacity.
Yeah.
But the models that you used to train yourselves and now you're just importing someone else's foundational model, those change so often you need to be flexible to the market.
Yeah.
This is a really interesting crosscut. I am curious, and I don't want to dive too deep into any confidential realm, so let me know like where the boundaries are. But in terms of model training, do you take any of those foundational models and do additional human learning reinforcement on them or additional training, or are you taking foundational models and only providing context? Are you doing additional training or are you only providing context?
There are a lot of different use cases. I think it depends on that. I think like with anything, it depends on the product, what you have to weigh, what's useful there, if it's good enough, what needs you have. So I think it's really dependent on the product itself.
Gotcha.
But, yeah.
So a lot of things are changing for us in the world of AI. There is shift from non-deterministic to deterministic. There is shift for need for greater strategic thinking, also greater flexibility and adaptability, iteration. What are you seeing, Alexa, in terms of these changing things? The changing technology breeds changing need for changing mindset and changing culture. Where do you see the change taking us?
So on the topic of staying up to date, I feel like I have a lot of context in this because I'm in this every day. And there are a few different perspectives here too. I think that as a platform team, the challenge is as we talked about, there's so many models being output, like models being deprecated. There are so many new versions coming out. There's so many things just being output all the time that as a platform team, what you want to do is abstract away as much as possible that the user needs to know and give them something that's easy to use, easy to understand. And I think now from the user's perspective too, it's difficult because, for example, a story is someone just upgraded their model, like from version 4 to version 5 or whatever it was. And all of a sudden it wasn't working. And the question was why? Oh, well, now this is a reasoning model. Like version Y is a reasoning model. And I think that when you look at all the models, they have so many different features, so many different specifications, even within a given model family, that the context you need to know about it right now is pretty large. You need to go and read the docs. And this has always been true of any version change you do. Of course, you need a change logger to understand what it is. But I think what's interesting now is because of how quickly it changed, how much the features changed, and how there's so many different models and different use cases. Like some models are good for certain things. Some models have large context windows. Some models do not. And so there are all these variables that go into play when understanding what model should I use, not even within different providers, but even within the same provider. And then you add different cloud providers on that as well. And then it gets even more complex because there's different features that they do and don't allow there. So as a platform team, it's trying to understand how can we create something like a model garden, a registry where people can always use the newest models and understand them in a certain way, understand their benchmarking, understand their latencies, understand their features, and also how can we then make that easily accessible to them, and how can we also support that? So for example, every model has a different way to interact with it. Like Anthropic has its own API. OpenAI has its own API. As a platform team, that's why we created actually the Envoy AI Gateway. One reason is because we want to manage the traffic to all these hybrid cloud environments, all these different models, and make it easier for the user to just like send a very simple request that can be interchanged for these things. That was like our goal, along with like cost monitoring and other things. And so with all the different APIs, it's like, how can we unify this experience to, if a user wants to, kind of just easily switch in and out between things. But the thing is that, for example, in OpenAI, maybe it has something, I don't know, like maybe one label is thinking, one's reasoning, and maybe the value is low, medium, high, and maybe on the other one, it's an integer 1 through 5. So how do you create a unified interface to translate all this? And like, just an anecdote for me is I was just working on implementing the GCP Anthropic cache feature. So let's allow like users to go through an interface and use that and translate it. Mm-hmm. And I was looking through the docs, and what I realized is that there are all these different specifications for how cache works for Anthropic specifically. Mm-hmm. And then there are only a certain set of models that you can use it with right now. And there's also specifications about how to use it, say for example on GCP. But I took the list of that model and I make an integration test. Like we can only test with these models, but that's going to change over time because things deprecate. So I think also, like from a platform perspective, it's how do I make sure that I have all these features available and that it's translating correctly, everything works correctly, and that I'm testing it correctly, and all of this is always up to date with the documentation.
In a constantly changing stream.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Well, I love this tactic that you talked about as a thinking like a platform engineer, developer enablement team of, I believe you call it the model garden.
Yeah.
Which sounds like not just use of certain models that are maybe tested or approved for organizational use, but also some data that's available, like benchmarking attributes of it, so that when somebody's picking which model do I want my IDE to go to for this task, you've provided them with some information on how to go evaluate that?
Yes, I think that's the goal, right? Is to be able to say, here, come choose whatever model you want. And you don't need to know that XYZ 3.123, you don't need to go look up that these are all the features. We can kind of show you based on your use case what you want to use and what's best for your use case. I think building a platform is making an abstraction that makes it the easiest to use, right? And I think that just putting the model name there, just that a person needs to have context on what version 5.123 does is a lot for the user, right? So finding a way as a platform team to abstract that and also giving them a way to observe it. If they're testing different models, I think that's another thing is how do we then give them the tools to correctly observe what do they need to observe in order to make that decision about which model they should use. I
really love this. In a simplified way of thinking about it, most of us are familiar with the the fast dumb model will get you a fast answer. And if you do thinking, you can often get a better answer, but you have to wait on it. If you take those elements, but multiply them by the massive combinatorics of all the models, features, changes, this is more than any one person can consume. But as platform teams can document and make this simplified in a consumable way, this is a really way to empower your organizations to be able to keep up to date on a constantly shifting landscape.
Yeah, exactly. And I think as part of the platform team, not just knowing up front, like what should I choose, how should I deploy, but as we kind of touched on, like the after part of that, how do I evaluate my model? So I think another interesting point is the things that we need to evaluate and the metrics we use has changed a little. Like, of course, we still need latency. We still need to know our latency, but what does latency mean for Gen AI? Like, there are certain things you can measure, like time to first token. So if you're talking about user experience, latency for Gen AI is a huge one because you're streaming tokens. So your first token is your perceived snappiness, like how quickly can you respond? And then every token after that, how it flows, that also determines your user experience. So latency is no longer like my P99, I return to 200, because as we know, you could return 200 and you could have done it quickly, but maybe you gave garbage something back. I don't know, like some answer that was unuseful, right? And so how do you for Gen AI and a platform, how do you understand how you're measuring a model, which model is performing? So we've thought a lot about that. And then, how do you make these measurements something actionable? How do you make it an SLO? When do you get an alert on it? How do you know? So I think when we touched on LM evaluation, you get all these scores, right? But for every prompt, you're going to have a score. And you're probably not going to be looking through every prompt. So the question is, how do you make all of these measurements and all this data into something actionable for understanding your system and how it's performing?
As an old telecoms guy, in the world of SIP protocol, you have not just latency, but also jitter. And when I think about this, the idea of it's not just time to first token, but also how it spins out in a whole slew of other metrics that are important in being able to evaluate what's the right choice for me. Well, Alexa, I've really enjoyed having you on the show. This has been absolutely fascinating conversation. For the folks at home that would love to keep up with you online, where can they connect with you?
Yeah, so I'm on X as Lexalu, LEXAL0U. It's kind of confusing there. You can find me on my podcast. It's called Alexa's Input AI. It's on most podcast platforms. You can also find me on LinkedIn. It's Alexa Griffith, and also on my website, it's like www.alexagriffith.com. So I think that's everything.
We will put all of those links into our show notes. And Alexa, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Created by the team at buoyant.io.